Chapter 9, Race and Ethnicity. Sociology helps us in understanding racial-ethnic relations. Race is a social construction. So to start, let's consider to what extent race is a myth versus a reality. And then we'll talk about ethnic groups, minority groups, and ethnic work. With its more than 7 billion people on the planet, the world offers an array of people with a variety of human characteristics. Depending on our geographic location in the world, people's physical complexion, the color of our hair, texture, the texture of our hair, our physique, these things are all adapted to meet the climate and living conditions. Now, race refers to the inherited physical characteristics that distinguish one group from another. These distinguishing characteristics include a variety of complexions, colors, and shapes. And although there have been significant studies in the understanding of race and racial equality, myths of race are still very common. It is a myth to think that any race is superior to others. Throughout our history, there are examples of this in which the myth is put into practice, and we see this in terms of the Holocaust, the massacre in Rwanda, and the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. These are examples of a genocide and a mass killing of groups of people because of their race or ethnicity. Race is a myth because there are no pure races, or what we call race is a social construction or classification, not biological categories. The mapping of the human genome, our complete set of DNA, shows that humans are homogeneous or very much alike. The classification of race is complex. There is a myth of a fixed number of races. In fact, social scientists cannot all agree on the classification. Some classify humans into 2 groups. Others have defined thousands. The myth of race makes a difference for social life because people believe these ideas and they believe these ideas are real, and then they act on these beliefs. Now, most people may not act as extreme as Hitler in the genocides or any other extreme groups, but many people are ethnocentric enough to believe that their own race, if even just a little bit, is superior. Therefore, we expect the color line to continue, even if many deny that it exists. Now, race is a reality in the sense that humans come in different colors and shapes. So we need to acknowledge that there is a reality, and race is defined as a group set apart because of physical difference that have taken on social significance, so that these physical differences have taken on social significance. And that's the definition we're going to use as we proceed through this chapter. Race and ethnicity are often due to the cultural differences people see and the way they define race. The terms ethnicity and ethnic group refer to the cultural characteristics that distinguish a people. Ethnic groups are set apart by their national origin or distinctive cultural patterns, food and clothing, language, religion. Now, the term or the word ethnos is derived from the Greek word meaning people or nation. Again, we get that definition in terms of that cultural origin, their national origin. Polish Americans, Italian Americans, Irish, German, etc. So ethnic groups are set apart by their national origin. Now, mathematically speaking, a numerical minority is a group that makes up less than half of some larger population. But a minority in the sociological sense is a subordinate group whose members have significantly less control or power over their own lives compared to members of the dominant group. Minority groups are people singled out for unequal treatment and who regard themselves as objects of collective discrimination. So minority members are not necessarily in the numerical minority. In fact, at times we call them the majority minority. And so sociologists refer to those who do the discriminating as the dominant group instead of majority because they have greater power, they have more privileges, and they have higher social status. The dominant group attributes its privileged position to its superiority, not to discrimination. A group becomes a minority through the expansion of political boundaries because it incorporates people with different customs and languages, values, or physical characteristics, and then discriminates against them. Another way for a group to become a minority is by migration into a territory, either voluntarily or involuntarily, like in an example of slavery. Now, some people feel an intense sense of ethnic identity, while others feel very little. An individual's sense of ethnic identity is influenced by the relative size and power of the ethnic group, its appearance, and the level of discrimination aimed at the group. If, for example, a group is relatively small, has little power, has a distinctive appearance, and is an object of discrimination, its members will have a heightened sense of ethnic identity. Ethnic work refers to how ethnicity is constructed and includes enhancing and maintaining a group's distinctiveness or attempting to recover their ethnic heritage. In the United States, millions of Americans are engaged in ethnic work, which has challenged this notion or idea that our nation would be a melting pot, with most groups quietly getting along. This is also referred to as symbolic ethnicity, or when we attempt to identify with traditions and customs of our particular heritage. We try to maintain, clothing often, or food preparation, how we prepare our foods, language, to religious practices, even holiday traditions. Now, this illustration sort of describes illustrates what I was just describing in terms of the sense of ethnicity. A heightened sense is where you have fewer numbers of members of that particular ethnic group. They have less power, very different from the national identity, and are the object of discrimination. So you see a heightened sense of ethnic identity among those group members. If where there's a lower sense, there's those individuals may be part of the majority. They have greater power. There's more have more similarities to the national identity, and they're not faced with discrimination. Now, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to click on these links. I did provide the links for this in e-learning. If you go under the video doc or web link tab in e-learning. Jane Elliott's experiment, blue-eyed, brown-eyed experiment. I'd like you to take a look at that. It's a really eye-opening experiment that she has done. Well, the poll everywhere. We're not going to be able to typically do that in class. But there is another video in e-learning, the Prince EA video as well. So after watching the Jane Elliott video, you kind of get a sense of what prejudice and discrimination is all about. Walking in someone else's shoes and seeing, how it feels to be, discriminated against and treated with prejudicial attitudes. So now we're going to talk and define and distinguish these terms. Both prejudice and discrimination exist in societies throughout the world. Now, discrimination is the unfair treatment directed toward someone. It is typically behavior that denies someone opportunity based on their race, gender, ethnicity, age, or some other characteristic. When based on race, people know it as racism. It also can be based on many features like a person's weight or their age, sex, sexual preference, disability, religion, or politics. Prejudice is a prejudging of some sort, usually in a negative way. So whereas discrimination is a behavior, prejudice is an attitude. Now, sociologists have determined that discrimination occurs at the individual level, but it also occurs at the institutional level. Now, individual discrimination refers to negative treatment of one person by another. Institutional discrimination refers to negative treatment of a minority group that is built into society's institutions. That is, people are denied opportunities within normal operations of business based on race, ethnicity, gender, age, etc. And there are some examples here, home mortgages and healthcare. With regards to home mortgages, race and ethnicity is a significant factor in getting a mortgage or a car loan. Researchers found that even when two mortgage applicants were identical in terms of their credit histories, African Americans and Latinos were 60% more likely than whites to be rejected. So even when not rejected, they were often given higher interest rates, and this was nationwide. This is referred to as predatory lending. This is also called systemic discrimination because the behavior was part of the banking system and not just individual bankers. The Justice Department found countrywide financial to be engaged in discriminatory practices against Latino and African American borrowers. They agreed to pay a fine of $335 million for that predatory lending. When it comes to healthcare, in terms of healthcare, there are differences in social conditions that result in differences in nutrition, differences in medical care. So it's not the result of differences in biology. For example, if there are more minority group members in poverty, the social location may result in less access to quality health care. And here is a table depicting what I just described in terms of the mortgage issue. These applicants who were denied a mortgage, and you can see the majority being Latino and African American, the purple and orange bar. And then you see the applicants who were charged higher interest rate or given subprime loans in the far right column. Again, higher percentages, 36% Latino and 43% African American. So this is a definite example of institutional discrimination. And this table illustrates health and race and ethnicity, comparing whites to African Americans, the number of infant deaths and maternal deaths, and then the life expectancy of both whites and African Americans. It seems to be females have lower life expectancy than white. African American females have lower life expectancy than white females, as well as male. But females are significant. Like we usually see women living longer. Now I'd like to talk about, go over our theories. So first we'll go over psychological theories and then the sociological. From a psychological perspective, according to John Dollard, prejudice results from frustration. People who are unable to strike out at the real source of the frustration, they find scapegoats to unfairly blame. Gender and age and immigrants are also common targets of this scapegoating. So for example, take unemployment. Many blame immigrants for the high unemployment rates for Americans. They, in quotes, are taking American jobs. So they blame them for, we blame immigrants, we blame women, we blame the elderly for taking these jobs. Elderly are not retiring, and so therefore they're taking up a job that could be going to someone else who is unemployed. Now, there was a psychologist by the name of Theodore Adorno who argued that highly prejudiced people are insecure, intolerant people, and they long for the firm boundaries established by strong authority. He said that highly prejudiced people were people who have deep respect for authority and are submissive to those authority figures. He called these personality traits the authoritarian personality. So things with individuals like this, he described things were either right or wrong. They become anxious when norms and values are different from their own. And they view people who differ from themselves as being inferior. So they have this personality that they are superior beings. Other subsequent studies have generally concluded that people who are older, who are less educated, are less intelligent, and are from a lower social class are more likely to be authoritarian, fit into this authoritarian personality type. Now I'd like to focus in on our sociological perspective. So we're going to focus on how social environments influence prejudice. And we're going to take a look at our functionalist perspective, our conflict perspective, and our interactionist perspective. So first, functionalist. To functionalist, the social environment can be deliberately arranged to generate either positive or negative feelings about people. Prejudice is functional, according to functionalists, because it creates in-group solidarity and out-group antagonism. According to anthropologist Manning Nash, prejudiced beliefs provide a moral justification for maintaining inequality. Racial beliefs discourage subordinate minorities from questioning their low status. And it encourages support for the existing order because an end to discrimination would bring greater poverty to minorities and would lower the majority's standard of living. Now, prejudice is dysfunctional because it really truly destroys human relationships. So we have a sociologist, Arnold Rose, who described how prejudice and discrimination is a dysfunction. So Arnold Rose says that society fails to use the resources of all individuals. Discrimination aggravates social problems such as poverty, delinquency, and crime. A society must invest a good deal of time and money to defend its barriers to the full participation of all its members. And finally, racial prejudice and discrimination undercuts goodwill and friendly diplomatic relations between nations. Now, to conflict theorists like Oliver Cox, Robert Blauner, and Herbert Hunter, they use exploitation theory or Marxist class theory to explain racial subordination in the United States. Now, this theory suggests that racial subordination keeps minorities in low-paying jobs, thereby supplying the capitalist ruling class with a pool of cheap labor. Also, by splitting the workers along racial ethnic lines, they benefit because solidarity among the workers is ultimately weakened. The higher unemployment rates of minorities creates a reserve labor force from which the owners can then draw from when they need to expand production temporarily. The reserve labor force is a constant threat to workers, to white workers in particular. Racial ethnic divisions at work are encouraged and exploited because it weakens the workers' bargaining power. They do not develop class interest or that class consciousness that we learned about with Karl Marx. Instead, they learn to fear and distrust one another. And next we have symbolic interactionism. And to a symbolic interactionist, The labels we learn color our perceptions, leading to selective perception, just how labels create prejudice attitudes. We see certain things and we're blind to others. So applying a label to a group, we tend to perceive its members as being all alike. We disregard evidence that doesn't fit. Racial and ethnic labels are especially powerful because they are shorthand for emotionally laden stereotypes, ugly words that belittle other groups. So with labels and the self-fulfilling stereotypes, the symbolic interaction is stress that we learn our prejudices in interactions with others. These stereotypes not only justify prejudice and discrimination, but they also lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy, stereotypical behavior in those who are stereotyped. Now, there's two concepts that have come out of this theorists who are symbolic interactionists, and one is contact hypothesis. And this was introduced by interactionists, stating that a contact hypothesis states that in cooperative circumstances, interracial contact between people of equal status will cause them to become less prejudiced and to abandon any previous stereotypes. And then another theory proposed by William Julius Wilson is about interracial coalitions. Now, William Julius Wilson said that these coalitions would be built on equal roles for all members as a possible way to eliminate or reduce stereotyping and prejudice. Now, here is that video. If you can click on this link, if it doesn't work, while you're watching this video, then go over to your Blackboard or your e-learning if you haven't watched it. Princia, it's a very short YouTube video describing labels and how that labels have often become the self-fulfilling prophecy. We're not born with these labels. It's a social construction. See that? Now, the next thing we're going to talk about are intergroup relations, these global patterns. And sociologists have found 6 ways that dominant groups treat minority groups. Racial and ethnic groups can get along and relate to one another in a variety of ways, ranging everywhere from friendship and intermarriages to the opposite end of the spectrum and hostility. So we're going to talk about each of these and look at the spectrum. Genocide, we're talking about population transfer, expulsion, internal colonialism, segregation, assimilation, and multiculturalism or pluralism. And this is the continuum I just mentioned. On one end, genocide, population transfer. Those are the more extreme forms of hostility. And at the opposite end, we have multiculturalism or pluralism, and more acceptable forms of intergroup relationships. So first, genocide. And genocide is the actual or attempted systematic killing of an entire racial or ethnic group that is labeled as less than fully human. Labeling a group as inferior facilitates genocide. It's sort of the good versus the bad. And so you really, the in-group versus the out-group. You sort of demonize the out-group. And you can see this as an example. Most extreme example is the Holocaust. And even the U.S. government and how it treated Native Americans. But also Rwanda in the 1990s, the Hutus tried to destroy the Tutsis. So we see a lot of examples that relate to this. Labels that dehumanize others help people compartmentalize. They can separate their acts from their sense of being good and moral, decent people. Now, population transfer or expulsion is an involuntary movement of a minority group. And it can be, this can be through 2 ways, indirect transfer and direct transfer. Now, the indirect transfer involves making life so miserable, so unbearable, that members of that minority group leave voluntarily. The direct transfer involves forced expulsion, expelling people from their homes as a means of acting on racial or ethnic prejudice. Some examples of this actually are, and prior to the genocide and the Jews in the Holocaust, they were expelled from their homes and moved to ghettos. But also Roma gypsies in France in 2009. Serbia's ethnic cleansing in 1991. They expelled the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it's a forcible expulsion. Ethnic cleansing is a forcible expulsion. Ultimately, leading to a genocide. Also, the 1979 Vietnam expelled the Chinese. In the United States, Japanese Americans were interned in relocation camps, internment camps. Native Americans were forced onto reservations. And so, again, we see quite a lot of evidence of this in history. Internal colonialism is society's policy of exploiting a minority group by using social institutions. Slavery, for example, is an extreme example, as well as South Africa's system of apartheid. Segregation is the formal separation of groups. The dominant groups impose this pattern on a minority group. Dominant groups maintain social distance from minorities, yet still exploit their labor. So this physical separation occurs in terms of residence, where a person lives, where they work, their workplace, and any social events. So again, we've seen examples in the U.S., lunch counters and buses and water fountains, and so the idea of separate and unequal. So in the U.S., in the South, until the 1960s, we've seen this segregation occur, apartheid in South Africa, and in India's untouchable. So even though India has done away with the system, the caste system, there's still that legacy of the untouchables and segregation occurring there. Next, we have assimilation, and assimilation is the process by which a minority group is absorbed into the mainstream culture. And there are two types. There's forced assimilation and permissible assimilation. Forced assimilation occurs when the dominant group prohibits the minority from using its own religion, language, or customs. Permissive or permissible assimilation is when the minority adopts the dominant group's patterns into its own way and or at its own speed. And I put in this definition that we often use. A plus B plus C often are the different cultures, and then A being that dominant culture. So all the different cultures kind of take on the patterns of the dominant group. This really strikes at the root of a person's identity. They may drop their own language, their native tongue. They may change their name, switch religion, to accommodate and to assimilate into the dominant culture. Multiculturalism or pluralism permits or encourages ethnic variation. That's, A plus B plus C, all of those different cultures equals A plus B plus C. They coexist. Switzerland is an excellent example of pluralism. So it's based on mutual respect for one another's cultures. In Switzerland, there's no national language or dominant religious faith. Political devices safeguard the interest of the various ethnic groups. So all groups basically there coexist. The French, the Italians, Germans, Romansh, the people in ethnic group of Switzerland. They've kept their own languages and they live in political and economic unity. So ideally, that's something it's an ideal here in the United States that we all can coexist and be a pluralistic society. Unfortunately, the race and ethnic relations that exist in the U.S. we're not quite there. So let's see where we are in terms of race and ethnic relations in the U.S. The terms we use for race and ethnicity in the U.S. are controversial. The way they're classified, how people identify themselves. Identity is very fluid, constantly changing, and these terms often take on very politically charged meanings. White Americans, for example, make up 61% of the U.S. population, with racial and ethnic minorities comprising the other percentage. And you can see the breakdown here. Latinos are 17%, African Americans 13%, Asian Americans 5%, Native Americans 1%, and then 3% who claim more than one race or ethnicity. So this is data from the Census Bureau, and so you see, if you see the question, census is being conducted right now. If you see the question on that census survey, you could see how that question is phrased for people to identify their race and ethnic background. So the U.S. is truly, if you look at it, as a multiracial, multi-ethnic society. This table further illustrates, it's a little tiny, but it further illustrates the breakout, those of European descent, African Americans, Asian Americans, and you could see the percentage of each group. Again, based on census data, the statistical abstract of the United States. Now, if you look at the map and see the distribution of dominant minority groups tend to be clustered in areas. So the distribution of dominant minority groups rarely comes close to the national average because minority groups tend to cluster in regions. And you can see here the green states are higher than average. So the highest percentage of minority groups actually live in Hawaii, California, and New Mexico. And you can see like states like Texas and Florida, even New Jersey, New York. We see countries where we have a large influx and large urban populations as well. But areas where many immigrants come into the country as well in those various states. So let's review the major groups in the United States. First, European Americans. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or the abbreviation or the acronym is WASPs, established the basic social institutions in the U.S. when they settled the original colonies. They established the culture. WASPs are highly ethnocentric, and they viewed immigrants from other European countries as inferior. Subsequent immigrants were expected to speak English and adopt other Anglo-Saxon ways of life. White ethnics are white immigrants to the U.S. whose culture differs from that of WASPs. They include the Irish, Germans, Polish, Jewish, and Italians. They were initially discriminated against because WASPs felt that something was wrong with people with different customs. As white ethnics assimilated into the Anglo-American culture, WASPs began to include them. Because white Europeans gained power, their institutional and cultural dominance set the stage for current ethnic relations. Next we have Latinos or Hispanics, and these terms do not refer to a race, but to different ethnic groups. Latinos may be black, they may be white, they may be Native American. So Latino is really an umbrella term. It lumps people from many cultures into a single category. Taken together, these people form the largest ethnic group in the United States. They trace their origins to the Spanish-speaking countries of Latin America. When Europeans first arrived on this continent, Latinos had already established settlements in Florida and New Mexico. With regards to the countries of origin today, Latinos are the largest minority group. About 32 million trace their origins to Mexico. About we'll see on the exact percentage, over 60%. 4 million to Puerto Rico, 2 million to Cuba, 8 million to Central and South America. While most are legal residents, large numbers have entered the U.S. illegally and avoid contact with public officials. When it comes to unauthorized immigration, see some of the key issues. The migration of Mexicans across the U.S. border has become a major social issue. To prevent illegal entry, a wall was started along the 2,000-mile border of Mexico and the U.S. A group called Minutemen, who organized through the internet, are volunteers who patrol the border. They're also known as techno-patriots. And these techno-patriots, they don't get paid. They're volunteers. They monitor the border using computers and thermal imaging cameras. And when they see or detect someone or movement along the border, then they contact officials. In 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act permitted unauthorized immigrants to apply for U.S. citizenship. Of the over 3 million who applied, majority were from Mexico. And in 2012, President Obama signed an executive order allowing work permits to unauthorized immigrants who are not over the age of 30, arrived here before age 16 years, are in school or are high school graduates, and have no criminal record. When it comes to residents, Latinos and Hispanics are concentrated in 4 states: California, Texas, New York, and Florida. Mexican immigrants are causing major demographic shifts, so we're seeing that in the demography. When it comes to Spanish language, the Spanish language distinguishes Latinos from other minorities. Approximately half are unable to speak English without difficulty. So there's a major obstacle when it comes to language, especially in getting higher paid jobs. Some perceive the growing use of Spanish as a threat. They have initiated an English-only movement and have succeeded in getting states to consider making English their official language. Economic well-being. Compared with non-Latino whites, Latinos are worse off on all indicators of well-being. They're 2 times as likely to be poor. Family income is 3/5 that of whites. The country of origin is significant. Cuban Americans score much higher on indicators of well-being, while Puerto Rican Americans score the lowest. People from South America and Cuba attain more education than those coming from elsewhere. And when it comes to politics, politically speaking, divisions are based on social class and again, country of origin, sort of prevent political unity among Latinos. And here we see it's 68% that represents the Mexican origin of U.S. Latinos. And then you can see the further breakdown. Other Central American, other South American, Spain, Colombia, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. The largest, obviously, the largest percentages from Mexico. Here are indicators of well-being. We see median family income, compared to whites, families who live in poverty. Race and ethnicity, and some more income extremes. And this also we'll talk more again about this when it comes to our discussion of African Americans. You can see the percentage make less than 15,000 versus who make more than 100,000. African Americans are the lowest. Latinos are the lowest, and next to African Americans in terms of who makes more than 100,000. And then obviously, and the same holds true for the higher percentages of less than 15,000. Here we have to see the percent of education completed, higher percent of less than high school when compared to whites. Okay. So those data, those tables illustrate what I just described. Now I'd like to talk about African Americans who face really a legacy of racism. after slavery, Jim Crow laws, Southern states passed legislation known as the Jim Crow laws to officially segregate blacks from whites. In 1896, U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that separate but equal accommodations for blacks was reasonable use of state power. This ruling was used by whites to affect political power and prohibit voting rights. Restrictions were then placed by ability to read. She had to show ability to read in order to vote. Rising expectations in civil strife. In 1955, African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama, using civil disobedience tactics like sit-ins and peace demonstrations and walks that were advocated by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They protested laws believed to be unjust. This led to the civil rights movement that challenged patterns of racial segregation throughout the South. The 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Rights Act heightened expectations for African Americans that better social conditions would follow these gains. However, frustration over the pace of change led to urban riots and the resultant assassination of Dr. King, which then prompted the passage of the 1968 Civil Rights Act. Since then, African Americans have made political and economic progress. For example, African Americans have increased their memberships in the U.S. House of Representatives in the past 30 years. Enrollment in colleges continues to grow. 40% of all African American families make more than $50,000 a year. But the current losses, those are the current gains. Now, the current losses, despite these gains, however, African Americans continue to lag behind in politics, economics, and education. In 2004, Barack Obama became the first African American man to be elected to the Senate. In 2008 and 2012, elected President of the United States. Currently, African Americans average 59% of whites' incomes. Only 11% of African Americans have graduated from college, and African Americans are 6 times more likely to be homicide victims than whites. So, a sociological debate, race or social class. According to sociologist William Julius Wilson, social class, not race, is the major determinant of quality of life. And he wrote 2 very controversial pieces of work called The Truly Disadvantaged and The Declining Significance of Race, if you're interested. That's William Julius Wilson. The African American community today is composed of a middle class who took advantage of the opportunities created by civil rights legislation and advanced economically, living in good housing, having well-paid jobs, sending children to really good schools. But also a large group of poorly educated and unskilled African Americans were left behind. Opportunities for unskilled labor declined, and they found themselves in poverty, facing violent crime and dead-end jobs. Sending children also to lesser schools. And despite gains made by some African Americans, others argue that discrimination based on race persists. African Americans are still paid less than white Americans for the same job. So racism is still, it continues to be an everyday burden. It's still part of life. Researchers found evidence in job hiring practices, for example. Resumes that have, this is research that was completed, where they looked at resumes that have had white-sounding names. The research shows that they received 50% more callbacks than those having more black-sounding names. Also, voices that sounded like a white voice were more likely to receive callbacks about rental apartment availability. And again, this is research that was published in the American Sociological Association. Finally, female African Americans are in a double bind situation. They are discriminated against because of their race, ethnicity, and for being a woman. And we call this the matrix of domination, where more than one social factor kind of puts somebody at a disadvantage. Patricia Hill Collins and Bell Hooks were known for that matrix of domination that African American women experience, and Hispanic women. Next, we have Asian Americans. 15 million people are lumped together and assigned the label Asian. Asian Americans have long faced discrimination in the U.S. For example, Chinese Americans were drawn here by the gold strikes in the West and the need for unskilled workers to build the railroads. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, suspending all Chinese immigration for 10 years. And when the Japanese arrived, they met with spillover, they called it spillover bigotry, a stereotype that lumped all Asians together, depicting them negatively. Especially after the attack on Pearl Harbor in World War II, hostilities toward Japanese Americans increased, with many being imprisoned in relocation camps or internment camps. So that's one of the key issues, the background of discrimination. Then we have diversity. Asian Americans are a diverse group, often referred to as the model minority. They are better off than white Americans on many measures, but it varies by country of origin. On the average, Asian Americans have a higher annual income and lower unemployment rates than any other racial ethnic group. Those most likely to be in poverty come from Southeast Asia, Indonesia, for example, the Philippines, Cambodia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand. Some of the reasons for their financial success can be traced to three factors. Number one, a close family life. Number two, educational achievement. And number three, assimilation into the mainstream. Asian American children are the most likely to grow up with two parents. They have high rates of college graduation, and the high rate of intermarriage has enabled them to assimilate into the mainstream culture. Asian Americans are also becoming more prominent in politics. Hawaii, for example, has elected several Asian American governors and sent several Asian American senators to Washington. And here you see countries of origin of Asian Americans. China, 23%, India, 19%, Philippines, 18%, Vietnam, 11%, Korea, 10%, Japan, 5%, and other countries, 14%. Native Americans. Due to the influence of old movie westerns, many Americans tend to hold stereotypes of Native Americans as being uncivilized. As a single group of people subdivided into separate bands or tribes. The diversity of the groups, in reality, Native Americans represent a very diverse group of people with a variety of culture and languages. There's over like 554 varying tribes. Although originally numbering between 5 and 10 million, their numbers were greatly reduced to a low of 500,000 due to the lack of immunity to European diseases and warfare. Today, there are about 3 million Native Americans who speak about 150 different languages. From treaties to genocide to population transfer. At first, the relationship between European settlers and Native Americans were very peaceful. Yet, as the number of settlers increased, tensions also increased because they stood in the way of expansion. Many Native Americans were slaughtered. Their government policy, the government policy at the time shifted to population transfer, with Native Americans being confined to the reservation system. If you remember history, the Trail of Tears, where Indians were removed and forced to walk thousands of miles. Another cruel act was the 1890 Wounded Knee of South Dakota. The U.S. cavalry gunned down 300 men, women, and children and threw their bodies into a mass grave. So very much so genocide, the expulsion, exposure to diseases, and many atrocities. The invisibility or the invisible minority of the Native Americans today are an invisible minority. We call them a third, live in 3 states, Oklahoma, California, and Arizona. Most other Americans are hardly aware of them. They live very isolated. They have the highest rates of suicide and the lowest life expectancy of any U.S. minority. Only 13% graduate from college. Educational attainment is very low. There is actually a movement to encourage attendance in college and college higher education attainment among the tribal community. The negative effects of the European American settlers continue to result in stresses. It is documented there's high levels of alcoholism, drug abuse, also very risk-taking behavior. With the high use of alcohol and drugs, a lot of car accidents and a lot of suicides. So very, very, a lot of and high poverty rates as well. In the 1960s, Native Americans won a series of legal victories that restored their control over the land and their right to determine economic policy. So the U.S. Paid retributions of millions of dollars for the lease of their land. Many Native Americans have opened up businesses on their land, ranging from industrial parks to the casinos. Now, here's the thing about the casinos. In 1988, a law was passed allowing Native Americans to operate gambling establishments on the reservations. It's a $27 billion industry, and more than all casinos in Las Vegas combined. At one point, there was an issue with the Gaming Commission on the equitable distribution of income. So again, that needed to be worked through when it came to the casinos. So we're looking toward the future. Central to our country's history, immigration and the fear of its consequences is once again an issue facing the United States. We hear it all the time among presidential candidates. The concern has been that too many immigrants will alter the character of the U.S., undermining basic institutions and contributing to the breakdown of society. In some states, like California, the racial ethnic minorities constitute a majority. And so there is fear that Spanish speakers will threaten the primacy of the English language, and that immigrants will take jobs away from native-born Americans. Another central concern is the role of affirmative action. And this was an attempt to combat past discrimination. Liberals argue that this is the most direct way to level the playing field of economic opportunity. Conservatives believe such practices will result in what they call reverse discrimination. In order for the U.S. to become a multicultural society, people must respect differences and work together without any group dominating others, and racial categories need to be seen as irrelevant. And we need to eliminate that system of categorization.